Hello Acmeware. Today we're going to be setting up two CIPC phones running VoIP through VirtualBox. The first thing we're going to do is set up our NAT network with the supporting IPs that we need to run. After we have our NAT network set up, we're going to open up our Linux Mint VM that we're running and upgrade and update it. Some pretty basic stuff that we have all done before. Next, we're going to install our text editor. I'm using Vim. Next, we're going to install Dynagens, Dynamips, and our bridge utilities so we can run our routers. Now that we have that set up, we're going to create a configuration file for our router config. So first of all, we're going to create the directory, and then we get our 7200.bin router, and then we're going to add it into our router.conf. After that, we can now change our virtual machines into our NAT network and change the promiscuous mode to allow all. This will let all the virtual machines talk to each other. After we change our virtual machines here to our NAT network, we're going to open up our networking interface. First, we're going to copy our networking interface to our home directory just in case we have a backup, in case something goes wrong. Next, we're going to ifconfig to find our port, and then we're going to go into our networking interface with our text editor. Next, in our text editor, we're going to add that interface that we saw with ifconfig and our BR0 interface, which is our bridge interface. Next, we're going to change the bridge interface port to our direct connector port, and we're going to add our addressing scheme to it and our gateway, which will always start with a 1, and because it is a NAT network, it's going to be the VirtualBox. Next, we're going to start up our Dynamips. This is going to start our server control on port 2000 for our routers. Next here, we're going to go into our router directory and create a router.config file. This config file is going to be set up for both our routers with our bin file image, where the working directory is, what console port it's going to be, what tap interface it's going to be, which will be linked to the bridge. After that's done, we can right quit and ls our file so we can see that we have our router.configure file. Next, you could start your router.conf file with Dynagens. You just Dynagens the config file. Then we're going to start R1 and start R2, have our console R1 and R2, and telnet R1, R2, so we can actually get into them when we have our interfaces added. Our next one is we're going to use the bridge utils that we installed earlier so we can create the bridge and add our tap1 and tap2 interfaces to it. This will let the routers connect to the bridge interface, which is connected to our host machine interface. Once that's done, we're going to go into our console interfaces that we set up on our router.conf earlier. So you could just telnet localhost 2521, and that's going to console into your first router. Now we're going to set up our router configurations. First, you're always going to start off with your host name, and then we're going to add our interface with our IP address scheme that we're using. As you can see, the interface is now coming up, so we're just going to show it, and there we go. Now we're going to do the same one for R2. We're going to set up R2 just like we did R1. See here, we're setting up our host name, change it Matthew R2 instead of Matthew R1 so we know which one it is. And then we're going to set up our IP address within the same subnet. No shut, and now your interface will be up. Now with our routers, we're going to set up our DHCP pool. This will let our IP phones and our servers, if we wanted to, get a IP address from the router. We do need to set up our network that we're using. So we're using a 192.168.5 networks. Then we're going to have our default router be this router here. And option 150 with this router will enable the router to be able to send an IP to our IP phone. So after this, we're going to pull up both our phone services that are running and install our Cisco IP communicator. Once both of these IP communicators are installed, we can go ahead and set our servers to both have a static IP, or we can even let them get a IP address through our routers. I set them here as static. It's just slightly easier and quicker depending on what you're working with. After you're done setting up the IPs, you can always go into the command terminal like I did here and use ipconfig. ipconfig is going to show you your default gateway and your IPv4 address that you just set. Now we're going to restart both our phone VMs after turning off our firewalls, just to make sure that pinging goes through when we want to check connectivity and phone calls will go through. Technically you would set up a rule for this, but this is our own home server, so we're just going to be turning off the firewall. Once our servers here are restarted, we're going to log back into them. And the first thing we're going to do is try and install our phones. Obviously, we're not going to be able to right away because we need to enable sound, as these are in virtual machines, they don't have sound settings set. So we're going to go to services, we're going to scroll all the way down to Windows Audio, making it automatic start and start it up. We need to do this on both VMs to make sure it works. After we have that set up, we can now select and tune our Cisco IP communicator. We can find the device name. This contains the MAC address. I recommend writing this down so you could use it later when we set up our phones in our routers. So there's highlight, copy, paste, or write them down, whatever you need to use. Next, we're going to go back into our router 1 and we're going to set up our ePhones. So first of all, we're going to go to telephony service. This is going to start the service on the router. Then we're going to set how many ePhones we're going to have. We're going to set up 2. We only need 1 though. Now we're going to set up our source address of this router and what port, referring to our dynamips that we set up. Then we're going to specify how many dial numbers we're going to have. And then we're going to go into our ePhone 1. First of all, we're going to add our MAC address that we wrote down earlier for our first phone, and you're going to input it there. That will register the phone. We're going to put in what type the phone is. This is a CIPC phone, Cisco IP communicator. Then what codec the audio is going to use. After that, we're going to go into our ePhone DN to set up our first dial number. We're going to specify the number 7801 and the name that the number references to. After that, we're done setting up our dial number. After setting up our dial number, we can go back into ePhone 1 and specify which button we're going on the phone that we're going to apply the DN to. Since we just did this on our first router, we can now speed through the second one. The only changes will be our IP source address will be our second router, and then our MAC address for the second phone. And then after that, we're going to set up our ePhone DN, and we're going to have a slightly different number. It's always good to save your configurations. I just saved both of mine just in case something went down, something happened. Next, we're going to set up one of the last things, and we're going to set up our dial peer. This is going to let us set a dial peer of which phone we're calling and a destination pattern so the routers understand where the number is going to. As you can see here, we have our destination pattern, which is the other dial number on our phone 2, and then on R2 for our phone, we're going to change the destination pattern to our first phone. After we're done setting up our destination pattern, we're going to add a session target IP, and this is the IP of this other opposite router, just so they understand where the information is going to. After we're done this, we're going to load up both our phone 1 and phone 2, and we're going to add the TFTP server. This is the router specified so that they can grab the information of the ePhone, the DNs and everything, and also grab an IP from our DHCP pools we set up. Once our phones are loaded up here, we only have one last thing to do, and that is to try dialing each other. As you can see here, we are now going to dial our other phone just to make sure that both of them can reach each other. And there we go, both phones reach each other, so we now know the dial peer is good. That's how you set up a Cisco CME phone. Lastly, as you saw on the phone itself, it had a Cisco CME system message. If you wanted to change that system message, you go into each router, you go to your telephony service, and you change the system message itself. You can change this to whatever you want, being Matthew's phone, Matthew's VoIP, and as soon as this loads up, we can see that each of the phones will now have a new system message. If you guys like the CME setup, always hit the like and subscribe button and leave a comment in the comment section below and let me know what you think about it. Thanks everybody, bye.